Life Stories brings you another unforgettable tale of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice. Today's story follows Malik, a young boy whose quick thinking saves a child's life but thrusts him into a dangerous battle against corruption and greed. With the odds stacked against him, Malik must rely on his bravery and the unlikely alliances he forms to uncover the truth and stand up for what's right. It's a journey of growth, sacrifice, and hope that will inspire you to believe in the power of doing what's right. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The day began like any other at the Pinnacle shopping mall. Its grand entrance, adorned with sparkling glass panels and gold-plated signage, stood as a beacon of luxury. Inside, the air was filled with a curated symphony of soft music, laughter, and the hum of commerce. Wealthy families strolled leisurely, their lives seemingly untouched by struggle. Among them were the Prescotts, Grant, Evelyn, and their 1-year-old daughter, Sophia. Evelyn's eyes sparkled as she held Sophia close, pointing out colorful displays in the storefronts while Grant carried their shopping bags with a smile that radiated pride. For the Prescott family, this was another carefree Saturday, one they spent embracing the privileges they often took for granted. But not everyone at Pinnacle Mall shared their reality. Across the bustling atrium, Malik, a lanky 13-year-old boy with wide, searching eyes, walked with a cautious step. His hand gripped his worn backpack, its faded fabric a stark contrast to the sleek designer bags carried by the mall's usual visitors. Malik wasn't here to shop, he never could afford that. He was here to escape, if only briefly, the cramped apartment he shared with his mother and 2 younger siblings. The mall was his window to a world he didn't belong to, a place where he could pretend, even if only for a moment, that he wasn't defined by struggle. Malik's dark skin and second-hand clothes drew the wary gazes of security guards. They followed him at a distance, their radios crackling as they exchanged whispers about a suspicious individual. He felt their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment pressing against his chest. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Malik had grown used to the sting of suspicion. But today, it felt heavier. He kept his head down and tried to ignore the tightening knot in his stomach. Above it all, on the rooftop terrace, Mason Prescott stood alone. He was Grant's younger brother, and his sharp suit and polished shoes spoke of a man accustomed to success, or at least the appearance of it. But Mason was not a content man. He seethed with jealousy. Grant had always been the favored one, inheriting the family's wealth and business while Mason was left to claw his way into a semblance of respectability. His bitterness festered like a wound. And today, it had reached its breaking point. Mason's eyes narrowed as he watched the Prescott family from his vantage point. His mind churned with a twisted plan, one born of anger and desperation. He didn't just want to harm his brother, he wanted to destroy him. His gaze shifted to baby Sophia, blissfully unaware of the dark thoughts directed her way. Mason clenched his fists, his heart pounding as he plotted his move. At that moment, Malik, wandering aimlessly through the upper levels, stumbled onto the rooftop terrace. He felt drawn to the open air, to the promise of a brief reprieve from the claustrophobic tension below. As he stepped out, Malik noticed something strange: a stroller, unattended and rolling slowly toward the edge of the rooftop. His heart skipped a beat. For a second, he couldn't move, his mind grappling with the surreal scene unfolding before him. Then he saw her, Sophia. Her tiny hands clutched the sides of the stroller, her bright eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Malik's instincts took over. Without a second thought, he sprinted toward the stroller. Weaving through the scattered crowd, voices rose in alarm, but no one moved fast enough to act. Malik's sneakers pounded against the concrete, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Just as the stroller reached the edge, Malik lunged forward, his hands gripping the handlebar with a strength he didn't know he possessed. The momentum nearly carried him over, but he planted his feet firmly. his body trembling as he pulled the stroller back to safety. Gasps erupted around him. For a moment, there was silence, a collective intake of breath as the reality of what had almost happened sank in. Evelyn arrived first, her face pale with terror. She scooped Sophia into her arms, holding her so tightly that the baby let out a small cry of protest. "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved her. You saved my baby." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Malik, gratitude and disbelief mingling in her expression. But not everyone saw Malik as a hero. The security guards, already predisposed to mistrust him, closed in with suspicion etched into their faces. "What's going on here?" one demanded, his tone sharp and accusing. "What were you doing near that stroller?" Malik opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. He was used to defending himself against accusations. But this time, he was too stunned, too overwhelmed to respond. Evelyn stepped between Malik and the guards, her voice firm. "He saved my daughter's life," she said, her eyes blazing with indignation. "If it weren't for him, her voice broke again, and she hugged Sophia even closer. As the commotion unfolded, Mason watched from the shadows. His jaw tightened as he realized his plan had been thwarted. Not by Grant or Evelyn, but by this boy, this nobody. Mason's anger burned brighter, his mind already scheming how to turn the situation to his advantage. For Malik, the moment was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, fear, and a strange sense of pride swirled within him. He had acted without hesitation, driven by a gut instinct to protect a life, even one so far removed from his own. But as he stood there, under the watchful eyes of strangers, he couldn't shake the feeling that this act of courage would cost him more than he could imagine. And so, the stage was set, one moment of bravery intertwining two lives in ways neither could have foreseen. The rooftop terrace was still abuzz with murmurs, the aftermath of Malik's heroic act rippling through the small crowd that had gathered. Yet, instead of basking in gratitude or admiration, Malik found himself under scrutiny. The mall's security team, whose suspicion of him had begun long before the stroller incident, now hovered around him like vultures circling prey, their accusatory gazes and sharp questions carved through the moment of relief. "What were you doing up here in the first place?" one guard barked, stepping forward. His badge glinted under the sunlight, a stark reminder of his authority. Malik hesitated, his throat dry. I just came to the rooftop for some air," he managed to say, his voice barely audible over the rising chatter. His heart pounded, not from the sprint to save Sophia, but from the oppressive weight of being treated like a criminal. Evelyn turned sharply toward the guard, anger flaring in her usually calm demeanor. "He saved my daughter's life," she said, her voice trembling with emotion but firm in its conviction. "How dare you question his intentions?" The guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't relent. We're just trying to figure out what happened. It's standard procedure." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Standard procedure? The only reason you're questioning him is because you assumed he didn't belong here." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, even the guard looked taken aback. Malik stood frozen, unsure whether to be grateful for Evelyn's defense or fearful of what would come next. He wasn't used to anyone standing up for him, let alone someone like her, a woman of wealth and privilege, her pristine appearance a stark contrast to his own. But while Evelyn spoke with conviction, Malik could see the ripple of doubt spreading through the crowd. That doubt, however subtle, stung more than he cared to admit. The whispers were low but unmistakable. Who is he? Where did he come from? What was he doing near the stroller? Questions that Malik knew would follow him long after he left the mall. Then, stepping from the shadows, Mason Prescott entered the scene. His expression was a carefully curated mix of concern and authority. But Malik caught the flicker of something darker in his eyes. Mason approached Evelyn, his voice low and measured. "Is everything all right, Evelyn? I came as soon as I heard the commotion. Evelyn turned to her brother-in-law, her arms still protectively wrapped around Sophia. Mason. This boy saved her. She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Mason nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto Malik with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. Well, that's fortunate, he said, his tone as smooth as polished glass. But we still need to be cautious. Accidents like this don't just happen. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Malik flinched inwardly, recognizing the veiled accusation. Mason's words weren't meant to protect, they were meant to sow seeds of doubt. And Malik could see those seeds taking root in the expressions of the onlookers. Evelyn's gaze darted between Mason and Malik, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Are you suggesting, she began. But Mason cut her off with a disarming smile. Of course not, he said smoothly. But it's important to understand how this happened. We all want to ensure Sophia's safety, don't we? Malik felt the weight of Mason's scrutiny, the unspoken message clear: you don't belong here. You don't belong with them. Evelyn, however, refused to let Mason's insinuations take hold. She stepped closer to Malik, her voice steady. This boy did what no one else could. He acted when everyone else froze. I won't let anyone turn him into a suspect. Mason's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Of course. Evelyn. You're absolutely right, he said, his tone oily. But as he turned away, his eyes flashed with something colder, more calculating. Malik felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't pinpoint it, but he knew Mason wasn't done with him. The man's presence radiated a quiet menace, a promise that this wasn't over. As the crowd began to disperse, Evelyn placed a gentle hand on Malik's shoulder. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. You saved my daughter's life. I don't know how to repay you. Malik shrugged awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the ground. I just did what anyone would do, he mumbled. Though he knew it wasn't entirely true. He had acted not because he felt he belonged in this world, but because he understood the fragility of life, something his own struggles had taught him far too well. Evelyn smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude and compassion. Not everyone would have. You're brave, Malik. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. In her eyes, he saw something unfamiliar, genuine empathy. It was a kindness he hadn't experienced in a long time, and it left him feeling both comforted and exposed. As Evelyn led Sophia back inside, Malik lingered on the rooftop for a moment. The city skyline stretched before him, a chaotic sprawl of opportunity and indifference. He took a deep breath, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. But as he turned to leave, Malik caught sight of Mason watching him from a distance. The man's expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. Malik had disrupted something far bigger than he understood. And whatever Mason was planning next, it wasn't going to be good. For Malik, the rooftop had been a moment of triumph, a chance to prove his worth. But as he descended the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that his act of heroism had also painted a target on his back. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across Malik's neighborhood as he made his way home. The Pinnacle Mall and its towering walls of glass felt like a distant memory, though the weight of the day's events lingered heavily on his mind. His hand still trembled when he thought of how close the stroller had come to the edge and how he'd barely managed to save Sophia. He wanted to feel proud, to hold on to Evelyn's words of gratitude. But instead, he felt an unshakable unease, especially after the way Mason had looked at him. Malik's neighborhood was a world away from the pristine luxury of the Prescott's lives. The streets were cracked and littered, the houses worn from years of neglect. Yet, this was home, a place of survival, where every corner told a story of resilience. As he approached the small apartment he shared with his mother and siblings, Malik reminded himself to keep his head down. He couldn't afford to let the day's chaos follow him here. Inside, The apartment was alive with the sounds of his siblings laughing and arguing over a game. His mother, weary but steadfast, was busy in the kitchen, preparing what little they had into a warm meal. Malik's heart swelled with a mix of love and guilt. They depended on him in ways he wasn't sure he could live up to. He wanted to tell his mom about what had happened at the mall, about the baby he'd saved. But something held him back. He knew the story wouldn't end with just a thank you. Later that night, as the apartment grew quiet and his siblings drifted off to sleep, Malik sat by the window, staring out into the dimly lit street. His thoughts kept circling back to Mason. There had been something sinister in the man's gaze. A warning that Malik couldn't ignore. He tried to shake it off, after all. What could a man like Mason want with a boy like him? But deep down, Malik knew he wasn't safe. His fears were confirmed when he heard the low rumble of an engine outside. Peering through the window, he saw a black car idling across the street. Its windows were tinted, but Malik could make out the silhouettes of men inside. His heart raced. He didn't recognize the car. And in this neighborhood, that wasn't a good sign. Suddenly, the car door swung open, and two men stepped out. They moved with purpose, their expressions cold and predatory. Malik's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his backpack and darted toward the fire escape. He didn't have time to think, he just knew he had to get out. The apartment door burst open just as Malik slipped out the window. His mother's voice rang out in alarm, and Malik's stomach twisted with guilt for leaving her and his siblings behind. He prayed they would be safe, that the men weren't here for them. Clambering down the fire escape, Malik felt the icy sting of fear in his chest. He had no idea who these men were, but he could guess who had sent them. The chase began the moment Malik's feet hit the pavement. The men were close behind, their heavy footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyways. Malik zigzagged through the maze of streets, his breath ragged and his legs burning. He knew this neighborhood better than they did, but they were relentless. Every time he thought he'd lost them, their shadows loomed closer. As he ran, Malik's mind raced. He couldn't go home, it wasn't safe. He needed help. But who could he trust? Evelyn's face flashed in his mind. She had defended him before, had called him brave. Maybe she would believe him now. Clutching his backpack, Malik made a split-second decision and turned toward the wealthier side of town, toward the Prescott mansion. By the time he reached the gates of the Prescott estate, Malik was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. The imposing iron gates seemed to mock him, a reminder of the vast gulf between his world and theirs. He pressed the intercom button, praying Evelyn would answer. To his relief, her voice crackled through the speaker. "Hello. It's Malik," he said, his voice shaking. I need help." There was a pause, long enough for Malik's heart to sink. But then the gates swung open. Malik stumbled inside, his legs barely able to carry him. Evelyn met him at the door, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. "What happened?" she asked, guiding him inside. Malik struggled to find the words. "Men, they're after me. I think Mason sent them." Evelyn's face paled. She didn't doubt him. Not for a second. "Come inside," she said firmly. "You're safe here." But Malik wasn't so sure. As he stepped into the opulent mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just traded one danger for another. Evelyn might believe him, but Mason would stop at nothing to silence him. And now, Malik was standing in the lion's den, with nothing but his wits to protect him. The Prescott mansion was an entirely different world from anything Malik had ever known. As he stepped through the grand doorway, he was greeted by a cavernous foyer with gleaming marble floors and a chandelier that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the walls were lined with paintings of solemn-faced ancestors, silent witnesses to the turmoil brewing within their lineage. Evelyn led Malik to a quiet sitting room, her brow furrowed with concern. She motioned for him to sit on one of the plush chairs while she poured him a glass of water from a crystal decanter. Malik hesitated, feeling out of place in such an opulent setting. His clothes, damp with sweat and dirt, seemed to taint the pristine furniture. "Tell me everything," Evelyn said softly as she handed him the glass. She knelt beside him, her eyes level with his. Malik took a shaky sip before setting the glass down. "It's Mason," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why, but he's after me. He sent men to my house tonight. I had to run." His throat tightened as he thought of his mother and siblings, left behind to face the unknown. Evelyn's face hardened as she listened. "Mason," she murmured, her tone tinged with both anger and sadness. "I knew he was bitter. But this," she shook her head, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. His crossed a line. Malik hesitated before continuing. "There's more," he said. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a small ledger he had found earlier that night in Mason's office. He had grabbed it during a desperate search for answers. "I think this is why he's after me." Evelyn took the ledger and flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the pages, widening with each entry. It was filled with transactions, payments to gang members, bribes to officials, and other illicit dealings. The names, dates, and amounts were all meticulously recorded. A damning record of Mason's activities. "This is," Evelyn's voice trailed off, her mind racing. "This is enough to bring him down," she finished, her tone resolute. "But it's also why he'll stop at nothing to silence you." Malik nodded. "I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe you could help." His voice was tentative, as though he wasn't sure he had the right to ask for her assistance. Evelyn reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his. "You did the right thing by coming here," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Despite her confidence, Malik couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at his gut. The Prescott mansion felt like a fortress, but he knew Mason's reach extended far beyond its walls. And Evelyn, for all her strength, was just one person against a storm of corruption and power. Evelyn's mind was already working, her thoughts moving faster than she could articulate. "We need someone who can expose this," she said, almost to herself. Then her face lit up with an idea. "Lydia Hayes." Malik frowned. "Who's that?" "She's an investigative journalist," Evelyn explained. "Fearless and relentless. If anyone can take Mason down, it's her." Without wasting another moment, Evelyn picked up her phone and dialed. Malik listened as she explained the situation to Lydia in quick, precise terms. There was a pause, and Evelyn's expression shifted to one of relief. "She'll meet us," she said after hanging up. "But we have to act fast." As they prepared to leave, Malik felt a surge of mixed emotions, relief that Evelyn believed him and fear of what lay ahead. He knew exposing Mason would come at a price, and he wasn't sure he was ready to pay it. But the thought of letting Mason continue unchecked, of leaving his family vulnerable, steeled his resolve. The drive to Lydia's office was tense. Evelyn kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Malik sat in the passenger seat, clutching the ledger as though it were a lifeline. The city blurred past them, its bright lights masking the shadows lurking just out of sight. When they arrived, Lydia was waiting for them. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet determination. She ushered them inside without a word. Locking the door behind them, Evelyn handed Lydia the ledger, her expression somber. "This is it," she said. "Everything Mason's been doing. If this gets out, it could destroy him." Lydia flipped through the ledger, her lips pursed. "This is good," she said finally. "Very good. But it's dangerous. If Mason finds out I have this, he already knows." Malik interjected. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "He's coming after me. And he won't stop." Lydia's gaze softened as she looked at him. "You're brave to bring this forward," she said. "But you're right. He won't stop." The weight of her words settled over the room. They all knew what was at stake, but none of them were willing to back down. As Lydia began making plans to publish the story, Malik felt a spark of hope flicker within him. For the first time. He wasn't facing this battle alone. But as the night wore on, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the fight for truth was only just beginning, and the cost of that truth would be higher than any of them could imagine. The air inside Lydia's office was heavy with urgency. The small room, cluttered with stacks of papers and photographs, seemed to pulse with the gravity of the task before them. Malik sat in a corner, clutching his backpack tightly as Lydia worked at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The ledger lay open beside her, its incriminating entries illuminated by the harsh glow of a desk lamp. Evelyn paced the room, her phone pressed to her ear as she made arrangements to secure her daughter and herself away from Mason's influence. Though her voice was calm, Malik could see the strain etched into her face. She was risking everything, her safety, her reputation, even her ties to her family, to stand up against Mason. It made Malik feel a mix of gratitude and guilt. He hadn't asked for her help. But now that he had it, he wasn't sure how to bear the weight of her sacrifices. Almost there, Lydia announced, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She didn't look up from the screen as she continued typing. This ledger is going to blow the lid off Mason's entire operation. Once it's out, there'll be no way for him to hide. Malik's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, to trust that the truth would be enough to bring Mason down. But his fear of Mason's reach and the system that seemed to protect people like him loomed large. What if it's not enough? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Lydia stopped typing and turned to look at him. Her sharp gaze softened. It will be, she said with conviction. People like Mason thrive in the shadows. Once we drag him into the light, he won't have anywhere to run. Before Malik could respond, there was a loud crash downstairs. All three of them froze, their eyes locking in shared alarm. Lydia moved quickly, shutting her laptop and grabbing the USB drive that contained the digitized ledger. They're here, she said grimly. Evelyn rushed to the door, her voice low and urgent. We have to go. Now. Malik's heart pounded as they moved toward the back exit. His legs felt heavy, his breaths shallow. But he forced himself to keep moving. The sound of footsteps and voices grew louder, echoing through the narrow hallway leading to Lydia's office. Whoever Mason had sent. They were close. Stay low, Lydia whispered as she led them out into a dark alley. The city's hum seemed muted here, the danger pressing in on all sides. Malik clutched the backpack, holding the ledger tightly against his chest as they hurried away from the office. They didn't get far before headlights illuminated the alley, cutting through the darkness like a blade. A black SUV screeched to a halt, blocking their path. Malik froze as the doors swung open, and two men stepped out, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. Hand it over, one of them growled, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. His voice was calm, almost casual, but the menace in it was unmistakable. Lydia stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. You won't get away with this, she said. Her voice didn't waver, even as the man took a threatening step closer. Evelyn grabbed Malik's arm, pulling him back. Run, she whispered urgently. Take the USB and run. Malik hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't want to leave them, didn't want to abandon the people who had risked so much for him. But Evelyn's grip tightened, her eyes pleading. Go, she said. We'll distract them. With a nod, Malik turned and bolted down the alley, the USB drive clutched tightly in his hand. His lungs burned as he ran, the sound of shouts and footsteps fading behind him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The USB was the key to exposing Mason, and he couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. After what felt like an eternity, Malik found himself in a deserted park on the edge of the city. He collapsed onto a bench, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The enormity of what had just happened crashed over him, leaving him trembling with fear and exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Malik pulled out his phone and dialed Lydia's number. his hands shaking. It rang and rang, but no one answered. Panic began to creep in. Had they been caught? Were they safe? Before his mind could spiral further, a text message appeared on his screen. It was from an unknown number. But the message was clear: "We've got her. You're next." Malik's blood ran cold. His grip on the phone tightened as he stared at the words, their threat sinking deep into his bones. Mason wasn't just trying to silence him, he was hunting him. And now, Malik was completely alone. As he sat there, the USB drive warm in his palm, Malik realized the fight was far from over. If anything, it was only just beginning. The truth was out there, waiting to be exposed. But it came at a price. And Malik knew he was the only one left who could pay it. The night was quiet. The kind of silence that made the city feel eerie instead of alive. Malik sat on the park bench, his head bowed, the USB drive clutched tightly in his hand. His heart was still racing, his mind consumed by fear and guilt. He replayed the events in his head: the crash at Lydia's office, the black SUV, Evelyn's urgent plea for him to run. Now they were gone, and he had no idea what had become of them. The text message replayed over and over in his mind: "We've got her. You're next." He wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to release the storm of emotions churning inside him. Instead, he gripped the USB tighter and forced himself to think. He couldn't let Mason win. Too many people had risked everything to protect the truth. And now it was up to him to make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. Malik's fingers hovered over his phone. He needed help. But who could he trust? Evelyn had believed in him, had stood by him when no one else would. And Lydia, fearless, unrelenting Lydia, had risked her career, her safety, for this fight. He couldn't turn to the police. Mason's influence ran deep. And Malik knew they'd side with the Prescott name before they'd listen to a boy like him. His thoughts drifted back to Evelyn's words that day on the rooftop: "You're brave, Malik." He didn't feel brave. He felt like a kid in way over his head, alone in a fight against forces he couldn't even begin to understand. But if there was one thing Malik knew, it was survival. He'd spent his whole life navigating a world that doubted him, that pushed him to the edges. And now, that resilience was all he had left. Taking a deep breath, Malik opened his phone's browser and searched for Lydia's recent work. He knew she had allies: journalists, activists, people who believed in uncovering the truth no matter the cost. After a few minutes, he found the name of a local news station that often collaborated with her. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Malik stood, his legs shaky but determined, and started walking. The park gave way to empty streets. The city bathed in the dim orange glow of streetlights. He kept his head down, his hood pulled up, every shadow a potential threat. The walk to the news station was long and grueling, but Malik pushed through, his resolve hardening with each step. When he finally arrived, the building loomed before him like a fortress. The glass doors reflected his worn, anxious face, a stark contrast to the polished exterior. Gathering his courage, Malik stepped inside. The security guard at the front desk looked up, his expression skeptical. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. His tone clipped. Malik hesitated, his grip tightening on the USB drive. "I need to speak to someone about a story," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "It's important." The guard raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Malik admitted, his heart sinking. He couldn't afford to be turned away. "Not now. But it's about Lydia Hayes. She's in danger. I have evidence that could." The guard's demeanor shifted at the mention of Lydia's name. He picked up the phone, his gaze still on Malik. "Wait here." Malik nodded, his nerves stretched thin. He stood awkwardly in the lobby, his eyes darting to the doors, half expecting Mason's men to burst through at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, a woman emerged from a side door. She was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. "I'm Sarah Monroe," she said, extending a hand. "I work with Lydia. You said she's in danger?" Malik shook her hand, his relief almost overwhelming. "Yes," he said quickly. "She was attacked tonight. And I have this." He held up the USB drive. "It's everything Mason Prescott has done, payments, bribes, everything. But they're after me now, too." Sarah's expression hardened as she took the USB. "Come with me," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We'll keep you safe." She led him to a small conference room, where Malik recounted everything, saving Sophia, Mason's threats, the attack at Lydia's office. Sarah listened intently, her face a mix of anger and determination. "You did the right thing by coming here," she said when he finished. "We'll make sure this gets out. Mason won't be able to hide from this." For the first time in hours, Malik felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Sarah and her team were experienced, and they believed in him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time. It felt like the fight was winnable. As the night stretched on, Sarah's team worked tirelessly, verifying the ledger and preparing the story for release. Malik sat quietly in the corner, exhaustion tugging at him. But even as his eyes grew heavy, he felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd ever known. He wasn't just running anymore. He was standing up, fighting back. For Evelyn. For Lydia. For himself. And for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. Malik knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But he was ready. Because sometimes, survival isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to fight for something bigger than yourself. In the end, Malik's courage and resilience prevailed. With Sarah and her team's support, the evidence was released, sparking widespread outrage. Mason Prescott was arrested, his empire of corruption crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Lydia and Evelyn, though shaken, emerged as symbols of strength and integrity. Malik, once seen as just another face in the crowd, became a beacon of hope for those who felt invisible. This journey transformed Malik. He learned that bravery isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. With Evelyn's encouragement, he began sharing his story, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. The road ahead was long, but Malik was ready to walk it, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved a chance at justice and equality. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of resilience and triumph.